As long as I'm not double micked. Yeah, should be okay from my side. Okay. In this, will it be switched on, or do I have to switch it on at the moment? Okay. Even better. Wonderful. Let me put the pointer here. And maybe I can put my... I can put that here, maybe, if it's okay.
Yeah.
To have it here already.
I think Rita will make the opening remarks.
Okay. Then I...
And I can give you a flat pencil instead of that one.
I'm good with this one, I think. Yeah. I will just... Obrigada.
Okay, so hello everyone. Welcome to FLAD. It's a pleasure to receive you here at FLAD for another session, another presentation of the results of the Transatlantic Trends. I'm happy to present here Gesine Weber from JMF, German Marshall Fund, who coordinates the global study, and Raquel Vaz Pinto and Pedro Magalhães, who help us at FLAD to digest and prepare the comments from the Portuguese side to all the process of organizing this survey. This the Transatlantic Trends is an annual transatlantic survey that assesses public opinion on crucial issues regarding global order, international cooperation, and the transatlantic relationship. The report that you have there is the main product of the survey and provides a comparative analysis of European and North American perceptions on these topics. And you can delve on it and see that there are certain answers that are really, really interesting to see. Okay, so we have 14 countries surveyed, 10 EU member states, including Portugal, United States, Canada, Turkey, and United Kingdom. And it's interesting to compare the positions of each country in their assessment. For instance, in Portugal, we can see that there is a broad consensus on both the positive influence of both the United States and the European Union, on the importance of NATO and the support for Ukraine. So this confirms that, this survey confirms that in external policy questions, there is a huge consensus in Portugal on our crucial elements for our foreign policy. And so the importance of the European Union, the relationship with the United States, all this is very clear from these reports. And that's also a good thing for us. But this study also includes the relationship with China and Russia, or the public's perception on cooperations with democracies. The question fundamentally is it important for us to cooperate as a country mainly with democracies, or it is indifferent? And that is also, the answer to that is also, it's also very, very, very interesting and allows us to understand certain things. And so, from our side, from FLAD's part, we are very honored to once again be here presenting the Transatlantic Trends 2023. Because for us it's very important, there are certain elements in here that are very important. First, we want to support research on transatlantic cooperation and on the transatlantic relationship. And as we all know, this is a crucial moment in that regard. Second, we want to include Portugal among the countries that are surveyed. We want to know the Portuguese perception on the Portuguese position on these issues, and we want to be able to do so on a continued process. And third, because we believe, and we are strong believers, on the importance of surveying, that decision makers must be informed about what citizens support and what they expect. And that is why this report, of course, will be handed out to our political decision makers, so they can also have information and have a perception on what the Portuguese public thinks. Knowledge of public opinion to develop relevant policies, and public policies is fundamental, and also to effectively communicate with the citizens. So thank you for your presence here. We will have first Gesine Weber from German Marshall Fund present the main results of the study. Then we will have a conversation with Pedro Magalhães and Raquel Vaz Pinto, and we will also have time for a Q&A, so questions from the public. You can start thinking about them already. Thank you very much for your presence.
Yeah, hello everyone, and first of all, thank you again to you, Rita, for this warm welcome and for the kickoff remarks, but also to everyone from FLAD, particularly also to Leonor for the very smooth cooperation that we've had on this report now and also already for a few years. I'm very delighted to be here and discuss the Portuguese results, not only because we see that Portugal, on the one hand, is, when we look at public opinion, a very European and transatlantic country, but also because it's very important, I think, when we talk about public opinion and transatlantic relationship, to look at the debates that are happening not only in Brussels, but really in all the member states. And the results from the Portuguese report show us that they are definitely worth a deep dive into public opinion here. This is particularly interesting also when we talk a bit about the macro picture, because we see that the Portuguese results show us that this hypothesis that we often read sometimes in newspaper articles also, that there is an Eastern European and a Western European public opinion, that does not hold when we're looking at the data. Because it is much more diverse, and in fact Portugal, for example, is among the most ardent supporters of Ukraine, as already mentioned, is most optimistic about US influence in the world, or sees that most positively, and that was something that might not be expected when you look at where you think this support might be. Most people often say it's like Poland, Lithuania, but Portugal is a bit forgotten, so I can only invite you to really have a deep dive in that report, but we are also going to do that together now. Before I start, let me have a quick word on the methodology. We conduct polling in the 14 countries already mentioned, and we do that with samples of 1,500 people per country. The polling was conducted in the second half of June, started on 15th June everywhere, and then between 22nd and 25th, depends on how long it takes to have the full sample. The polling is representative, and for each country it is representative based on gender, age, and region, according to national standards, and then you have the variables that are normally used for national sampling to make the samples representative. So without further ado, I would say let's dive into that. I am not going to touch on all the questions, but on a few that I think were particularly interesting, and yeah, I think that already gives you a good impression of what the study is telling us. Okay. When we ask people what in their opinion, or who in their opinion is the most influential actor in global affairs, the picture is actually very clear. 64% say the US is the most influential actor in global affairs today, and then we have two smaller blocks, the EU and China. Although it's important to mention that we have an error margin in the study of 2.5 points, so when you see a difference here of 3 points, take that with a pinch of salt. Jumping to the conclusion here that the EU is seen as more powerful as China would be, from a statistical point, not serious. So keep that in mind whenever you see values in the study. What is interesting is that this vision of a unipolar world and a clear predominance of the US is held in almost all the countries. Respondents in the US, on top here, are most optimistic about that, or most likely to share that point of view. And among the Europeans, here we have the first European outlier is Portugal, and we are going to see that very often in the study. But even in the countries that are ranking on the bottom here, like Italy, you still have 57% who say the US is the most influential actor, and that is already, well, still quite a solid majority. So keep that in mind. 64% say the US is the most influential actor today, so two smaller points. Okay, let's go to 2028. Little travel in time. Looks different. This is how respondents think the world or influence in global order will look like in the next 5 years. We see a sharp drop in the influence of the US compared to how they see world order today, to 37%. So that's a drop by 27% when we compare that to how people see world order today. And on the other hand, people expect China to become much more influential. in the next 5 years. So today you have 14% saying China is the most influential actor, but 30% say it's going to be the most influential actor in the next 5 years. However, what is absolutely striking here is the diversity that we see in the transatlantic sphere. Because, for example, respondents in the US, 59% still are very confident of a predominant US influence in the next years. On the other end of the spectrum, you have Italy, where 51% say, so more than a majority, China is the most influential actor. And then you also have France, where 45% also see China as more influential in the next 5 years. And then a few countries that fall a bit in the middle range, but basically it's interesting also from a policy perspective to see that these perspectives, transatlantic perspectives, are drifting a bit apart on that, because that might also have an impact on with whom you want to cooperate when you see the influence of a certain power as more or less important. So we do not only ask people about the assessment of influence, so how influential they think actors will be, but also how they feel about it. In general, public opinion is quite a lot about feelings. It's what a certain thought sparks in people, also because answers are often, people don't take ages to respond on these questionnaires, to be honest. So it's really about their gut feelings, and gut feelings about US influence and global order are overall positive. When we look at that on the country level again, we see that Portuguese respondents also hold among the most positive views of US influence in global affairs. But what is very interesting here is that we see a striking generational gap, because 57% of people under 25 say the US influence is positive or feel positive about it, but 73 of the oldest respondents. So oldest respondents are above 55. And that means that we have a gap of 20, okay, let's say a bit less than 20%. So that's quite striking. And also another thing that was striking me as a German working in France is that when you look at the bottom, you have Turkey. That's something we also see quite often. But France and Germany rank on the very bottom, particularly interesting when you have a very transatlantic government in Berlin at the moment. When we look at EU influence, the EU's influence compared to US influence is perceived as even more positive in global affairs. But here we also see significant degree of variation. And again, particularly Portuguese respondents see the influence of the EU in global affairs as very positive, particularly when you compare that, for example, to Turkey, but also to the US. That's quite striking. However, another value that's striking when you look at the US is that 26% of respondents in the US do not know how to classify or how they feel about the EU's influence, but also tells a lot about the perception of the EU on the other side of the Atlantic. Diving into transatlantic relations as such, respondents mostly anticipate that this is going to be stable, think they are going to remain the same in the next 5 years. Relatively small shares, so 22%, say the relationship is going to become closer. And this share has dropped compared to last year. There we were still at 27% who say it's going to become closer. The share of those who say it's going to become more distant was also a bit higher. So we see a bit a race to the middle option here and continuity. However, again, this wouldn't be fun if we wouldn't have a very transatlanticist Portuguese public in this survey. So again, here we have 37% of the Portuguese public who say that the relationship is going to become closer, which is much higher than the average of 22%. Shifting away a bit from the topic of world order and transatlantic relations, we also always ask respondents what they think is going to become the most important security challenge for their country to address in the next years. And although the percentages here are pretty close, it's actually interesting to look a bit at how countries score in that, because in 11 of the 14 countries that we are polling, respondents say it's either climate change or immigration as a top security challenge, and only in 3 countries, not very much surprising probably, Romania, Lithuania, and Poland, respondents will say it's either war between countries or Russia. And that is actually striking for us because on the one hand, we see that climate change is always there as a security challenge. It was there as a top security challenge in 2021, next to pandemics. It was there in 2022, next to war between countries. And it is there this year again, next to immigration. So there is this one structural security challenge and this one more timely security challenge. This is a graph that looks much better when it's printed on paper. But the interesting takeaway here is that climate change is also seen as the major challenge by respondents in Portugal, 31%. And that's the second highest score across respondents, all respondents in the survey. Also knowing that we conducted a survey in late June, so weather conditions might also play in here. Okay, a quick dive into European security. Overall, respondents in the study, or in all countries, say that NATO is important for the security of their country, yet remarkably, that has not gone up since last year. So we see that the number has increased from 2021 to 2022, but it's staying stable and on a plateau this year. So it's going to be quite interesting to see what's happening next year, whether we are going down or whether it's staying up. However, I'm going to mention a few very high numbers here for public opinion research, and these are again the Portuguese numbers. 90% of Portuguese respondents say NATO is important for their country's security. Similarly, 93% of Portuguese respondents say the EU is important for their country's national security. So it's 77% on average, but 93% in Portugal. And this is also shared across party lines. So very remarkable finding, actually. And at the same time, we also see that 83% of Portuguese respondents say the US should be involved in European security and defense, which shows that as these views are also shared by more than 70% of all Europeans, European security seems to rely or should rely on in the eyes of the public on this triple approach of US involvement, NATO, and the EU. With regard to the EU, there was also a majority of people who say the EU should do more, significantly higher in Portugal with 86%. And when we then ask people how they want the EU to do more, most people say they want the EU to do more with partners and not necessarily alone. Interesting here is that the most advocates of strategic autonomy, or those who want the EU to go alone, are rather to be found in the Netherlands than in France. Quickly talking about Ukraine, because I feel this is maybe going to become a bit long. So let me wrap that up with Ukraine, and then we have a quick view on China. When it comes to support for different policy options on Ukraine, we find that it is very high on average. You see that here for NATO, EU membership, and financial support for reconstruction. But again, it is striking to see that there is a significant degree of variation. Again, you find Portugal on the very left of all these charts. So the support for either policy option here is highest. On the other hand, you find Germany on the very right of all of these charts. So it's a country where the public is most hesitant, and it often can be found alongside Italy and France, which particularly when it comes to future measures of the EU, I think is a finding that is alarming, to say it like that. Talking about the bilateral relationship with China, an interesting finding here is that 27% of respondents do not know how to classify the relationship, whereas 31% say it's a competitor and smaller shares see it as a rival or a partner. Again, Portuguese outlier here, because in Portugal we have 40% of respondents who say China is a partner. Smaller shares say it's a rival or a competitor. However, what is actually almost a bit paradox in this situation is that when we ask, we go to this graph, which is nicer in the printed one as well, When we asked then respondents how they want to or how they want to approach China in different policy areas, although the share of respondents who say China as a partner is relatively high in Portugal, Portuguese respondents are also most likely to say they want their country to take a tougher approach on China. They are above the average in almost all policy areas, particularly when it comes to climate change, human rights, and pandemics. So interesting finding and definitely something to look into deeper as well. Let's maybe skip Taiwan so that we can go into the discussion a bit more quickly. We also have a question on democracy, which is a bit striking, and I think here it's definitely on the Portuguese experts to weigh in later, because we see that overall the average of the perception of democracy has not changed over the last year. When you take the sample of all countries, calculate the average, it remains stable. But we see some significant movement here. So we see, for example, in countries that have recently held elections or will hold elections, like Turkey and Poland, it has improved. But we see very stark drops in Portugal, also in France, Germany, and Sweden. When it comes to cooperation with democracies, so going a bit in the outside dimension or in the foreign policy dimension of democracy, we see that most respondents would support if their country cooperated with democracies to address global challenges, but it's not unanimously shared. So there is also some variation. And interestingly, the country where you have a majority of respondents who say it doesn't matter, or like more respondents who say it doesn't matter than those who want to cooperate with democracies only are in the US. Last one, whom are we actually talking about here? In Portugal, we are talking about pretty interested citizens who are responding to this study, because we see that on average 86% in Portugal say they are interested in foreign affairs. There are no absolutely striking gaps. There is a slight gender gap, with men being a bit more interested or saying they are a bit more interested. This number is 7 points higher, and also older respondents being a bit more interested in younger respondents, gap of 10 points, but even for younger respondents, we are still talking about 80% or so. So this is like really striking results. And I think with that, I wrap it up here, and I think we can go in the discussion. Yeah, let's get back to work. Do we need the mic?
No. I'll speak from here.
Oh, okay. Then I go.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. It's really a pleasure to be here once again. I cannot emphasize enough the inclusion of Portugal through FLAD in this project. It's in many of the surveys that we study and analyze in the world, the ones from the Pew Research Center and many others, Portugal is not included. So in that sense, this is an enormous wealth of data, of resources for us to understand a country that is really quite interesting to follow in terms of its international patterns or its attitudes towards the international. And it's honestly nothing new. We were here last year and we kind of concluded the same, of course, with some differences, ideas. And Pedro and I divided the work. So I will be focusing more on the issues of the global order, and then, of course, China, no surprise there. And lastly, I will just look into the issue of the environment and how the public opinion in Portugal is looking at who is doing what and who is doing what in a really interesting way. So in terms of the most, I mean, it surprises nobody that we consider the US to be, in terms of the photograph of the moment, the most influential actor in the world. And as Gesine has already highlighted, when we ask people in 5 years from now, who do you think is going to be the country leading the world, or at least challenging that. And of course, it's quite interesting that in all the countries surveyed, including the United States, there is a rise in terms of the number of people who actually think that China is going to have a much more influential role. In the case of Portugal, the US decreases 3 points and China increases 7 points. And this is something that I find it's absolutely articulated with many other answers and reports that we have. Now, this is one thing. The other thing is, do we consider that influence to be positive or negatively perceived? And in that regard, it's between the United States and the European Union takes the crown, it's 85%, and the US at 70%. What is interesting is that China and Russia are viewed in a more negative way in terms of their influence. And Russia is, I'm pretty sure it doesn't surprise anyone that Russia has a negative perception. But what is striking for me when I looked at the data is when you look at the party affiliation or alignment, is that when you look at that, and Russia has Portugal, the Portuguese public opinion has a very negative image of Russia, 55% of the people that responded, and that amounts to, in the total of the negatives, 85%. And when we look at the political parties, it's absolutely consensual. And even within the CDU, it's also striking that we have 35% of the people have a very negative view of Russia, and 38% have a negative view. And that is interesting, taking into account the throughout this war, the public statements of many of its MPs and the party itself. If you would be interested, in terms of the parties, the one that has like the most negative image of Russia is Liberal Initiative. It points to 97%. And then it's followed by the left bloc with 92. So as you can see, perhaps there's some changes here that we need to pay a bit more attention to. Now, as to China, what would I highlight? Gesine mentioned that when we are asked, how do we see China? Partner, competitor, rival, or we don't know? Portugal has 40% of people who say partner. When you look at the age, it's quite interesting because the first tier, the 18 to 25 years, 25% say it's a partner, but 43% of that tier don't know. And I think this is interesting in terms of its way of the younger generation looking, although I know that, and I've learned this with Pedro, that we should take this with a grain of salt when considering age in terms of tendencies in public opinion. And when we look at the plus 55 years old, 47% consider China to be a partner. Perhaps a possible explanation for this is the historic links and the linkage of Portugal with Macau, and the older generation that, of course, looks to that experience in a very positive way, although I, of course, would add that Macau of 2023 is not, of course, the Macau of the 90s or the 80s. But if we would be stuck with this image, what is also interesting, and Gesine has already mentioned this, when we dive deeper into this, we realize that in terms of should we cooperate more with China, and the highest number is when we are discussing new technologies. And I think that's also pretty much linked to the expression and the quota of the market of, for instance, Huawei, or even the influence of TikTok in many other instances of our societies. Even so, it's also interesting, in the first tier of age, 52% would go with new technologies, above 55, 42%. So it's kind of interesting, this point we have now throughout 2023 regarding the 5G. There has been an exclusion of companies from countries that are not either NATO, EU, or OCDE, so this will also be quite interesting to see how it goes. In terms of climate change, which you also mentioned, and human rights, once again, it's interesting when we delve into this. Should we be tougher with China on human rights? We have 56% of people saying yes, we should, and it's 50% in the youngest, in the oldest. It's also it's even higher, 67%. So we get these mixed readings. And also, what I will also highlight is when we ask people, because sometimes we get this feeling that some of the answers to these questions are perhaps easier for the Portuguese public, particularly when it entails a potential cost in terms of economy, in terms of budget. So sometimes we have this feeling. And when we asked people if your country is to be tougher on China, even if this has a negative impact on your country's economy, Portugal goes to 51% saying, yes, we should pursue that road. As to the possibility, the scenario of an invasion of Taiwan, it's really consensual that we should work diplomatically to end the conflict, and don't think that it's only Portugal that thinks this way. It's basically everybody in the survey. So we don't even want to hear about that issue. Lastly, what I would like also to highlight, just to finish, is the issue of the environment. One of the very interesting things in this survey, and something that has been consistent with all the international surveys in which Portuguese public opinion has been asked, is the importance of climate change, the importance of the environment. We usually blow the scale in terms of the expression of that sentiment. And one of the questions that is asked here is, who is doing a good job? Who do you identify as being the actor that is actually looking at this issue in a thorough way? Firstly, the experts, the scientific community, which is really something to pay attention to, because we have sectors of societies in our liberal democracies that reject science or reject expertise. So I think that's also something to look at. And secondly, the NGOs. Then comes your government, the EU, and lastly, another, and this is my last comment, an interesting issue. The majority of Portuguese think that China is not doing enough on environment. And I think that's also quite interesting. So just to actually congratulate the German Marshall Fund. Once again, this is a really, really interesting case of how can you have all this information, all this knowledge, and present it in a very user-friendly way. It's a brilliant presentation, so thank you, Gesine.
Thank you.
So good afternoon, everybody. I would like to thank the Foundation for inviting me to be here and talk about this report, as I did last year, also with Raquel. I just also want to start by congratulating the German Marshall Fund and Gesine and her team for this work, and not only the amount of work that goes into designing these questionnaires, analyzing the data, contacting all these companies and teams. I mean, I sort of been there, so I have an idea how difficult it is. But one thing that is really successful in this report, and Raquel has mentioned this, and I want to stress this again, it's very difficult to communicate these data in a way that it's so successful as this report. The data visualization is really, really good, and it really conveys the results in an excellent way. I also wanted to congratulate the Foundation for supporting Portugal's continuing presence in this project for the reasons that Raquel already mentioned. Of course, I'm a bit suspect. You know that song by Burt Bacharach, What the World Needs Now? Do you know what it is?
Yes.
It's love, right? No, my answer is more data, right? So of course, I'm very supportive of everything that involves collecting data about Portugal. But I think this is really necessary for the reasons that were already mentioned, and also because, as Raquel said, there are a lot of similar projects that do not include Portugal. So we are very often left with, particularly for foreign policy issues, with transatlantic trends. So I want to stress 5 ideas. The first idea has already been mentioned by Rita, and we talked about this last year. Being European and Atlantic is not a zero-sum game for the Portuguese, apparently. It's not a dilemma. It's not a contradiction. We are the country where more people think that relations between the US and Europe will be stronger. We are the European country where more people think NATO is important for the country's defense. This hasn't changed since 2022. We are the 3rd country where more people say the US should be involved in the defense and security of Europe, more than 80%. But we are also the country that thinks the most that the EU should do more in the area of security and defense, and should do it more with partners. Even when you look within the sample, and you try to look for variations, I mean, they're there. Gesine mentioned some of this. Men are a bit more pro-US than women. People who are close to the 2 bigger parties in the center, PST and PS, are a bit more pro-US. It has been mentioned last year and also this time that there's a bit of a difference between younger and older, but the differences are there. They are, as we say, statistically significant, but they're not very big. And I wanted us to think a little bit about this, what this means, the results for Portugal. I think public opinion is the result of a very complex dynamic where, on the one hand, political parties, political elites, what they say reflects, because we live in a democracy, reflects what they think people think. They try to represent those ideas. At the same time, people react to what political elites say and do. They take cues from parties. And then what people think and what elites say is affected by historical factors, social factors, political factors. But I think when we see this level of consensus, we need to be a bit, I'm not going to say skeptical, we need to be a little bit careful about what it means. It means, I think, that foreign policy issues are completely depoliticized in the Portuguese context. It means that people do not listen, do not hear political parties saying very different things. They don't hear political parties placing in front of public opinion dilemmas, trade-offs, complications from the consequences of things like, as we were talking about in a minute, Ukraine should join NATO, Ukraine should join the EU. It's very easy to get this consensus when the issue is low salience and low in politicization in the political context. So This is not necessarily going to be like this forever. It has been so far. It has been so far in part because of what I said. Portugal's position in the world is a position that influences people's views and the views of political parties. But don't be persuaded, I think, that this sort of consensus and this absence of any understanding that there might be a dilemma or a trade-off between being European and being Atlanticist, don't believe that this is necessarily going to be like this forever among public opinion. This has to do partially, I think, with the low salience of foreign policy issues in the Portuguese political debate. The second thing I wanted to mention is also about this Atlanticism of Portuguese public opinion. It's an Atlanticism that is partially not corresponded by the other side. So the survey has a number of questions about how reliable the different countries think that other countries are. So 78% of the Portuguese think Canada is a very reliable country. Canadians, unfortunately, only 51% of them think Portugal is reliable. In the US, we think 69% the US is reliable. Well, 44% of them have the same opinion. And in the UK, 73, 56%. Of course, that a big part of this is the fact that a lot of Americans and a lot of Canadians and some British people have no opinion about whether Portugal is reliable or not. It's not, I mean, they don't know. It's not a country that's really clearly on their map. On the other hand, the UK result I found striking because the percentage of people in the UK that cannot answer the question whether Portugal is a reliable partner is the same percentage that cannot answer the same question in Germany. And yet, among those who give an opinion, the Germans tend to think that Portugal is more reliable than the British tend to think. So if I was, it's never going to happen, ambassador in the US or the UK or Canada, or if I was somehow related with Portuguese foreign policy, I would be a bit queasy about these results. They don't necessarily express the kind of reciprocity that we would, hope to find among countries that we support very, very strongly, I think, in all studies that have been done before. The third idea is Ukraine. So 78% of the Portuguese is in favor of the Ukraine in NATO, 81% Ukraine in the EU, 86% are willing to support, financially support. I mean, they think that Ukraine should be supported financially for reconstruction. I was looking at the marginals within the sample. It's really amazing that 53% of respondents who are close to the Communist Party think that Ukraine should get into NATO. Yes. It's really interesting. 57% of them think Ukraine and the EU, and 67% think that Ukraine should be supported financially in their reconstruction. Again, I want to call attention to depoliticization. When you see these kinds of results, you need to ask yourself, how salient is this issue in Portuguese political debate? How different are the parties' positions on this issue? And another thing you need to think about is about trade-offs. So you ask people, do you want this? Do you want that? You think this is great? Well, if you ask people, do you think taxes should be lower? I mean, everybody would say, of course. And then you ask them, okay, so shall we decrease social spending in order to be able to decrease taxes? No. So here, I think we have the same sort of situation. It's kind of an indirect suggestion for Gesine. A lot of these questions need to, well, let me put it this way. A lot of these questions might benefit from placing people before trade-offs. There's one of the questions in the survey that does just that when they ask, take a tougher stance on China, despite the economic consequences. Notice, when you ask the Portuguese, take a tougher stance despite the consequences, our support just goes down, right? We are not over-enthusiastic in comparison with other countries on the tougher stance on China, if this has negative economic consequences. So I think a lot of the other questions, if one would express the trade-offs, one would get a different result. But the reason why I hesitate is just this. It's just that if politicians don't express the trade-off, what's the real picture of public opinion? In Portugal, the trade-offs are not presented. Nobody talks about this. Nobody asks, well, let's financially support the Ukraine reconstruction. How much are you willing to pay? Nobody says this, right? So if nobody says this, what's the correct picture of public opinion? Is it the one where we in the survey express the trade-off? Or is the one that we get from the survey right now in the context where nobody talks about consequences or trade-offs? So I don't know. Both pictures are interesting, but I would love to be able to look at the other picture, when the consequences of these wonderful, virtuous choices would be expressed. Two more things. State of democracy. I'll be very quick. Nobody will be surprised. 51% of the Portuguese think the state of democracy is globally good, but 46% it's globally bad. 13% think democracy is in danger. And this is the greatest decline among all countries since 2022. And if you've been paying attention to the Portuguese political context, or the Portuguese economic context, I think nobody will be surprised. The last comment I wanted to make is about the responses to the question on the security challenge. I think they're very interesting. And I think they are telling. I'm not going to forecast the future. I'm just going to leave this right here as a possibility. So 31% in Portugal says climate change is a big security challenge, 20% immigration, 15% war. So what has changed since the previous editions of the survey? It's immigration. It's immigration. One thing that is always signal about Portugal international comparisons is how interesting it is that the topic of immigration is something that doesn't have the same importance, doesn't have the same consequences that it has in so many other European countries. So immigration in Portugal has been a low salience issue, to use again this word. Well, this is just one data point, but I'm not sure this is true anymore. And I think that if you live in Portugal, particularly if you live in Lisbon, and if you are attentive to what people are saying, if you're attentive to your surroundings, you won't be surprised that for more and more people, the issue of immigration is becoming more salient. And I don't think you will be surprised if this issue becomes more important in partisan rhetoric than what it has been so far. Just one data point. We need, what did I say? More data. But I think this is potentially announcing something is changing in the undercurrent of political discussion in Portugal. Thank you very much.
So I guess that we are now ready to take some questions, if I get that correctly, or?
Yes, Pedro has a rule that the first question has to be from the younger audience, right?
Yes, below 30.
You don't have to tell your age, though.
No.
I mean, if you feel 30, it's fine as well.
Oh no, that's wrong. No, not feelings, not feelings. No, so we have a lot of students in the audience, and it will be really great if one of you will be the very first question. Yes, you in the back.
I have a question regarding...
Can you just briefly introduce yourself?